Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Bard Graduate Center. Those of you here in the room and those of you watching on BGC TV from somewhere else. It's a pleasure to have you all here for what turns out to be the 10th anniversary of the Paul and Irene Hollister lectures on glass, which reminds me of the first lecture, which was delivered in the smaller seminar room in the adjacent part of the building in 2007 by David Whitehouse. And it was, aside from being a remarkable lecture on the Blaschkas, the great creators of the glass flowers at Harvard, and other things too, but it was also a great lecture as a piece of craft and has remained lodged in my memory and the memory of those who were there because and I say this not to intimidate today's lecture in any way. However, David showed a very strange lecturing style that night. If those of you were there recall, he would look at the screen, pause for a moment, look out in the audience, say, or rather enunciate 2 or 3 beautifully turned sentences, pause, click the slide, look at the screen, and then continued this way for an hour in a remarkably mellifluous, completely fluid way. And afterwards, he, as the crowd ebbed away from him, turned to me and said, "My secretary packed the wrong PowerPoint." So I don't think we're going to have that problem today, but I am sure that today's speaker, Dedo von Kerssenbrock-Krosigk, if he had to do that, or to deliver today's lecture blindfolded, would indeed be able to do so. But the 10th, recognizing the 10th anniversary also is something of a melancholy one for us here because just a few weeks ago, Irene Hollister died. And so you may have seen before the lecture formally began a series of images that we've been running on the screen. And I would like to invite my colleague, Catherine Whalen, who delivered this lecture a few years ago and who is working on editing an edition of Paul's papers, to come and say a few words about Irene.
So I think we can get this started again if you came in just now and missed it. So I first want to say that I met Irene maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, and she contacted me about editing this collected volume of Paul Hollister's writings. And at first I said, you know, I don't think I have the time that this project needs, right? This is a significant piece of work for future scholarship. And she said, okay, and she called me back. Irene did not give up. I think this is one of her most defining characteristics, and I'm really glad I said yes, because getting to know her has been a real privilege as much as working with this material has been. She was a mentor, and I think she was like this to many people that she met. I've had this discussion with Mary Jane Clark, who was her art consultant in the later period of life, and also Barb Elam, our own Associate Director of Visual Resources, who has been working with students to digitize these slides, which are both, the photographs are from Irene's own personal collection, and then the slides you'll see of glassmaking, let me keep going, a little bit later on, are actually from a series of 20 binders that Paul Hollister, actually Irene, gave us from his lectures. And they are a real treasure trove, as I hope you'll see in a moment. So Irene passed away, right, on February 22nd in Hanover, New Hampshire, where she and Paul were living for many years after they had lived in New York City. And I think many of you knew the Hollisters personally, but I think maybe many more knew them through their legacy. And I think that that's a really significant legacy. For us at Bard Graduate Center, we've also known Irene as a patron and a supporter. Paul was teaching some of the very first classes here on glass history, and there are some of his students here in the audience. And so he is really a founding member of our faculty, and early on a great contributor to the program. After he passed away in 2004, Irene became a steward of his legacy, in a way that I think is absolutely remarkable. And I'll talk a little bit more about what she's done to preserve that legacy and to advance scholarship in the history of glass, and particularly the field of studio glass, which is really just now kind of coming into the history of its own. So I'm going to read a little bit about Irene's life, because I think one of the things that, this is one of the slides from from Irene. That was one of Paul's. Paul took a lot of slides of, he wrote regularly for the New York Times, a lot of art criticism around studio glass, and he was really instrumental, I think, in both creating critical discourse around studio glass and the market. So he took a lot of his own photographs, both of these kinds of workshop situations, but then also of artist studios, and I think they're a really interesting record. He also had tried his own hand at glassmaking, and here you see him making the piece on the lower right. And he's worked with some of the most, and written about some really, really notable glass artists, and I can't even list them all, but they certainly include people like Paul Stankard, and Tom Patty. There you see, again, this work on the paperweights, which were very near and dear to his heart. Dale Chihuly, Michael Ashbrenner, many others, Sidney Cash, James Carpenter, Michael Glancy. And so I think what's interesting about his conversations with him is they were both about meeting new artists and understanding their work, but also educating them about the history of glass. And that really actually comes through in these interviews, which are just starting to be transcribed here, and then there's a whole series of them at Corning, which again, Irene gave to Corning. But in talking about Irene, one of the first things that everybody says is, oh, I didn't know the full story of her life. And it was really a remarkable life. And I have only talked to her briefly about her life outside of her stewardship of Paul's work, but it was really a fascinating conversation. She was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1920. She was the daughter of Leo and Alice McLean, and she graduated from University of Toledo in 1943 with a bachelor's degree in business administration. She then moved to New York, where she worked as an employment manager at Gimbels and Bonwit Teller. In 1960, she was hired as the first permanent office to establish the first permanent office for the Not-for-Profit Association for Computing Machinery. Founded in 1947, the world's largest educational and scientific society for computers. Founding members of the ACM noticed that her implementation of sound business practices and quality management marked the beginning of professional administration for the association. Irene was very modest about this, but it was clear that she had a huge impact on the organization and really transformed it. For example, during her 26-year tenure, the membership grew from 8,000 to 75,000, and she was instrumental in that as Director of Membership and Corporate Relations. She worked closely with the ACM Executive Council, and she traveled throughout the United States, which also gave her an opportunity to develop working relationships with computer science leaders in the fields of government, education, and research during a really rapid period of growth and innovation in this field. In addition to her professionalism, Irene had a talent for recognizing people of potential who she supported in training and mentoring, and she continued to do this for the rest of her life. I will say that the ACM has actually developed a project to document its own history. They started doing oral histories maybe about 10 years ago, and one of the first person they interviewed was Irene. And it really is a recognition of her significance to this organization. And it's also a great document, I think, for women's history and women in the history of computing, right? And the ways in which that history unfolded. And so I do hope members of the association will be able to watch tonight's lecture, and that we can recognize that important contribution to that field. So in 1951, she met Paul Hollister. She was moonlighting as an usher at Carnegie Hall. Paul was teaching journalism at New York University at the time. They were married for 53 years until his death in 2004. Paul was an artist as well as a critic. Probably he is best known as a critic, but I have talked to many people who know his artwork. This is an example of one of his pastel paintings done near their home in Hanover. He wrote for many magazines, and he wrote both for specialized glass journals and more popular publications such as Antiques. But his other work could be found in American Craft, the Corning Museum's Journal of Glass Studies, international publications. His reviews of studio glass exhibitions, which appeared in the New York Times, really shaped people's understanding of the field, people who had never encountered glass, maybe even never had bought art. One of our former students, Susie Stilbert, wrote about the Douglas Heller Gallery, and Douglas Heller tells this great story about how people would walk into his gallery with Paul's reviews in hand and say, I want to see this. You know, I've never bought this kind of work, but I want to look at this. I want to think about acquiring this. And I think it just goes to show how important that laying the foundation for that kind of criticism at a popular level is. So in 2007, Irene established this lecture series here. She had already given much of Paul's library here, and so we have a fantastic library on glass. She also contributed Paul's archives to the Rakow Research Library at Corning. And she, as I said, we are writing this anthology together and hoping to draw on many of those resources. When I talk to people about Irene, some of the adjectives that often come together, are untiring, quietly reserved, gracious, a fantastic mentor, and I think most of all, relentless in her desire to pursue whatever goals she was passionately committed to. When I've asked to sum up her character, the most succinctly I can do it is, she's the kind of person you want to be when you grow up. You want to have that kind of character. You want to have that kind of commitment and perseverance and grace and diplomacy. And we all could look to her as an example of that.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Tonight's speaker, Dedo von Kerssenbrock-Krosigk, studied art history, medieval and modern history, and classical archaeology at the University of Bonn, where he has his MA, and he has a PhD in art history from the Humboldt University of Berlin, where he worked on gold ruby glass of the later 17th and 18th century. He then moved to a position at the Brauan Museum in Berlin, where he published Modern Art of Metalwork in 2001, and then moved to Corning, where he was the curator of European glass from 2004 to 2008, ending with the publication there, Glass of the Alchemists in 2008. From 2008, he has been head of the Glasmuseum Hentrich in Düsseldorf, where he has most recently published Art and Alchemy, The Mystery of Transformation in 2014. I would say his area of expertise is in the early modern period, and in particular, the relationship between glass and alchemy. But more than that, I think he represents a rather unique combination of the kind of extraordinary understanding of materials and techniques on the one hand, and an ability to locate these materials and their techniques in a much broader cultural and intellectual context, which really represents in many ways the kind of approach to understanding the past through things that we at the Bard Graduate Center seek to embrace and create for the future, which makes him a deeply appropriate invitee for this year's Paul and Irene Hollister lecture.
Well, thank you for this very kind introduction. I must say I feel very flattered and privileged to speak in front of such a distinguished audience. All the more I have to deal with this subject that, even if you put this very nicely, as a museum person, of course, I'm dealing most of the time with the objects themselves. Now, in this lecture, I want to deal a little bit more with some, let's say, theoretical background, which makes it adamant that I need to use the manuscript. And that brings up the blindfolded part that you mentioned in advance, because with glasses it doesn't work, without it doesn't either, so I have to find somewhere. I might crouch down once in a while. Thank you very much also for this introduction into the lives of Paul and Irene Hollister. I very much regret that I didn't get to know either of them in person, But of course, their books have always been very important. And I wonder, I thought that Paul Hollister basically is the one to be accounted for to quip the term of the paperweight in general. It always occurred to me it's so strange that something that was essentially produced in France in the 19th century would have an English name. And of course, the vigor and the excitement of American collectors, I think, played a big role, especially after World War II, to have this renaissance of paperweights. And it's no wonder that the most beautiful pieces done today, let's say basically let's say since the 70s, are all of American origin. I can name, of course, a few artists. We've seen Paul Stankert on various slides. Josh Simpson, I'm not sure if he had any relation to Paul Hollister. So it is actually an exciting subject in itself. We will, however, not start with paperweights. We will start with something that has been trash at some point of its life. This is a Dutch beaker made in the late 17th, or in the early 17th century, actually. It was very likely used to drink beer, and it very likely was destroyed during this process. And it very likely ended up in a cesspit, which would be the pre-modern sewage system of the times. And then some would-be archaeologists, let's call it that way, because the origins of these pieces, they are not from official archaeology. They come rather from the field, what we call in Germany the diggers, must have excavated that cesspit and found some of those fragments and had somebody else to glue them together in a fairly professional way to end up with this object as you see it here right now. So I bet that the maker of this glass, as well as the user of the glass, would be amazed and surprised to find their piece represented in a lecture now, not least actually finding that this piece is now part of a collection and actually can be seen almost as a work of art in its own right, especially in this kind of destroyed version. So there are many ways to look at glass. Glass can be looked at from a historical perspective as an example of certain cultures, as an example of trade, technology, habits, rituals, and so forth. It can be appreciated as a work of art in its own right. For instance, here, the Sasanian glass very typically has found great appreciation already during its time of its making. Pieces like these have traveled as far as to Japan. There is a very famous bowl, which is actually rather similar to this one, to be found in the treasure of the Shoso-in in Nara near Kyoto, and also in some Chinese graves. And at the same time, designers of the 60s and 70s have been informed by these models for their design. For instance, for Venini, Carlo Scarpa would spring to mind. It's a timeless piece. Glass can be investigated under conservation aspects. For instance, the question whether its current appearance is original. You see that this piece looks actually very good. There are a few pieces missing, of course, and some of these shards show some sort of corrosion, while others look in a much better state, depending on how this piece survived for many centuries somewhere in the earth. At the same time, I actually like the fact that we now tend, if possible, to reconstruct pieces that have been broken, and actually most of the medieval glass and the Roman glass as well is broken when it ends up in a museum, to not fill it up with plastic, but rather to leave these voids, as they show, for instance, how extremely delicate the belly of this glass has been blown, while this part is more solid. And if you, which PowerPoint until now unfortunately doesn't deliver, if you could peek into the glass from down here, you would also see that this vessel has very specific technical characteristics of its making, which strongly distinguish this from such a bottle made in Europe, for instance. And finally, there's also questions, of course, which is actually a more recent subject of provenance, of collections, of looted art, plays more and more a big role, illegal digging, and all of that. So, what is so special about glass? What makes it worthwhile for a museum visitor to look at the glass collection? As a glass museum curator, I should put that question to myself every day. Why look at glass? Breaking this down into various facets, we can ask, was there something special about glass in the respective time of its making? Was glass highly luxurious? Was it affordable and cheap? Was it practical, magical, alchemical? Was it even sexy? What did people think when they thought about glass? For obvious reasons, we will never even remotely find out. But we can look at the available sources, particularly the written ones, and try to find out what literary texts of the past have to say about glass and the meaning that they saw in the material. In the following examples, I shall present to you little glimpses of the many rich and sometimes surprising ideas that people have developed when confronted with glass. We will begin with a look at mythology, before the advent of glassmaking, that is. We will discuss some texts that were written when glassblowing was first invented, to go on with a text that describes the alchemy of glass in the Middle Ages, and, time permitting, we may also look at some further medieval facets. To most of us today, glass is a natural given. Going back in time to the very beginning of its production, and to times of significant technological shifts, glass must have been something rather alien, a material that stirred wonder and thinking. The first glass, however, made by humans had quite a familiar natural parallel or model, which is stone. Common understanding among archaeologists is that glass originated in the region of modern Iraq and Syria at a time when the old Babylonian Empire was in decline, and a number of different people, such as the Hittites in modern Turkey or the Mitanni in Syria around Aleppo, gained ground. The making and use of glass really came up more or less simultaneously in that region and in Egypt around 1500 BC. It did not come as a spontaneous invention, but rather stood at the end of a long process featuring various glazed and glassy products. Most of the first glass was blue. Unfortunately, this is not an example for it, but you will see some blue glass later. An imitation of lapis lazuli. The Akkadian and Egyptian words for glass were the same as for lapis lazuli, distinguishing between the natural stone from the mountains and the man-made stone from the kiln. What are the implications? Was glass considered to be a mere cheap imitation? In lack of immediate written sources on the advent of glass, or for that matter on glass at all, let us look at those sources that tell us something about the meaning of stone. It turns out that in the Mesopotamian, Sumerian, Babylonian tradition, there's a lot to be found on that matter. I will concentrate on one single source. An outstanding source is the epic of Ninurta and the Stones, as its working title runs. You see the original title up there somewhere, yes. It is assumed to have been put into writing during the reign of King Gudea of Sumer. Today I stood in front of that statue, which was very nice indeed. That is long before glassmaking and in a different cultural background. The epic seems to have been very popular, however. It is the best preserved work of Sumerian poetry, and still formed part of the famous library of the Neo-Babylonian king Assurbanipal in Nineveh, some 1,500 years later. That is well into the tradition of glassmaking. The epic tells about the warrior god Ninurta and his war against Asaku, a demon. Asaku was born from the union of heaven and earth and built up an army of stones that he procreated from his intercourse with the mountains. The battles were fierce, as you would expect, but Ninurta, helped by his sword called Flattener, eventually succeeded in crushing the enemy. He piled up the fallen stones to form a mountain ridge that would later fertilize the land of Sumer with its waters, a creation myth. Then, and this is in our context the most fascinating part of this epic, Ninurta addresses the stones one by one. He gives them names. He judges the stones' respective roles in the war and either blesses or curses them. We may be reminded here of the Titans in Greek mythology. Stones are given a personality, and they are distinguished either as good or evil. Another early text that comes to mind, of course, is the biblical book of Genesis, where Adam gives names to the animals. Here, however, it is the stones that are named and subjected to rule. I give you two examples. First, the flintstone. Here, apparently, Ninurta is not amused at all. I shall rip you like a sack, and it's going to be something that is used for the most menial crafts. So apparently the flint behaved particularly badly in this battle. And quite differently, the lapis lazuli, which seems to have changed sides during the battle. And so it is going to be exalted. And one must know that in early, in these Mesopotamian cultures, lapis lazuli, of course, played a big role in the decoration of statues of the gods. So we see here a reflection of this in the text. And of course, flint could be used for glassmaking. I don't think that it has ever been suggested that flint was actually used for early glassmaking, but it is almost tempting to consider that. In this and other epics of old, stones are seen as an organic material, a bit like characters in a play, but they are potentially divine as they interact between the spheres of man and the gods. In such a context, the advent of glassmaking, of glass lapis lazuli that is, must have been seen somehow as an act of conquering the divine world of nature. At least it is quite inconceivable that it was just a technological gadget that came up and was greeted as something useful. Let me quote the English historian of science Eleanor Robson. I quote, "The manufacture of artificial precious stones touched upon the realms of their expertise in magic, medicine, and religion. Thus, even when it was no longer fashionable to manufacture colored glass, for the scholars of the time, it remained important to maintain a codified tradition of that knowledge. This is what we see in the Babylonian glass recipes. You have one in front of you, some of which mention rituals to prepare the furnace for the melt. Lapis lazuli and blue glass were not only much cherished in the Babylonian lands, but also in Egypt. Apparently, lapis lazuli ranked right after gold and silver, sometimes even before silver, in the Egyptian hierarchy of materials. And we have ample evidence for the import of lapis lazuli and artificial lapis lazuli from Mesopotamia. As far as we can figure out from archaeological finds, Egyptian glass started off with full perfection, only to decline towards the end of a roughly 500 years long period of a flourishing glass production. This glass actually is blue. You can't see it because it's corroded. Maybe just around the lips and the nose, it gives you a hint. From this period, very few, almost no, written sources on glass have come down to us. While other crafts were abundantly depicted and represented in the tombs, glass seems to have been an unusually secretive craft. The appreciation of glass in ancient Egypt can be deducted best from the actual finds in the royal tombs. Here, glass was fairly abundant, at least until the advent of the Ramesside dynasty. It is quite telling that the tombs of lower-ranking Egyptians who could not afford, or were perhaps not allowed, to own vessels made of glass or precious stones, were equipped with wooden imitations of both of these. One important source are the so-called Amarna letters, one of these actually also on exhibit at the Metropolitan, which date to the mid-14th century, from Amenophis III to Echnaton and a little later. about 350 letters survived, which are written in Akkadian and mention the palace of letters of the pharaoh. 5 of these letters, written by Egyptian vassals in the Near East to the pharaoh, do mention glass. And they usually run something like, "The king has written to me for glass, and I herewith send so and so many lots or pieces." Perhaps the most enigmatic aspect of these letters is that they do not mention any other wares except the glass, which is unusual. The other letters that mention other wares would always combine several different wares in one letter. Now I have to skip Phoenicia, Persia, Greece, all countries where glass played more or less an important role, and I go straight to Rome and the advent of glassblowing. Rome offers a much wider variety of written sources on glass than earlier periods of ancient history. Still, we gain but snippets of information, drawn from remarks on the side. The closest to something like a treatise on glassmaking would be the Naturalis Historia by Pliny the Elder of about 77 AD. In Book 36, he compiles the knowledge that was accessible to him about glass. This account includes the famous, albeit legendary, story of the accidental invention of glassmaking by the Phoenicians on the shores of the river Belus, a stream in today's Israel. Pliny is among the earliest authors to address the history and making of glass. This was an extraordinary shift from mythology and magic towards historical facts. It reflects a mentality and a form of curiosity that seems very familiar to us today. However, attempting to read Pliny as a modern author can lead to misunderstandings, as we can see with his core remark on the forming of glass. And this is where it begins. I apologize. I put up the original quotes, and you will have to deal with my English translation just spoken out. Where am I? He says that after the melt, the glass is either being shaped by blowing, ground with a chisel, or chased like silver. The first technique seems familiar enough to us, glass blowing. The second already sounds strange, and the third utterly impossible. Glass cannot be chased like silver. It has been suggested that the second technique, ground with a chisel, is an allusion to the forming of glass on a potter's wheel. That is the technique that some scholars suggested for the making of a variety of non-blown vessels. Pliny seems to have been tempted by the alliterations, flatu figuratur torno teritur, favoring stylishness over clarity. Also, a tornus can be translated as a tool for the wood lathe or the turning wheel. Nevertheless, I ask if Pliny should not be taken more literally. He could have meant the famous cameo glass that seems to have been produced right during his period. There is a fierce battle among glass technologists whether these vessels were actually carved or whether they were formed in a relief mold. Be that as it may, I think it would be very misleading to assume that Pliny was striving for a description of the glassmaking techniques that is accurate in our modern sense. It may become clearer when we look at his Argenti modo celator, the chased like silver. This is explicit enough. Glass chased or perhaps chiseled like silver. It has been suggested that Pliny might have been misguided by somebody who did not want to make the glassmaker's secret public. While it seems perfectly reasonable to identify this third glass technique with the making of mold-blown glass, you see an example here, I very much doubt that Pliny thought this to have been made with a hammer. After all, mold-blown glass not only looks like chased silver, but one could even claim that glass can be chased, not with the hammer, but with the force of breath. So why shouldn't it be called like that? Rather than inventing a new term for a technique that was a novelty in Pliny's time, and which he would have to explain to the reader, he draws on a vocabulary that a Roman citizen could understand easily and instantly, in order to grasp the essential. And that is, glass can be blown, it can be shaped, similarly to wood, silver, or stone. And these techniques, in just one sentence, Pliny presents glass to us as a material of outstanding technical versatility. A contemporary reader of Pliny must have reacted to this text quite differently from us today. Raising and carving sounded familiar enough, but blowing with the breath of the glassmaker, while to us flato figurator sounds perfectly, or at least quite clear, this was the only one of the three techniques that came as a complete novelty and had no correspondence in other materials. The following quote by Seneca in his Moral Letters to Lucilium of 64 AD is the one that amazes me personally most among all the respective Roman statements that I have come across so far. In translation, however, it sounds perfectly ordinary. And I quote, "I should like to show Posidonius, any glassblower who forms glass with his breath into various shapes that could hardly be accomplished even by the most diligent hands." Let me give you some background. The letter that this quote is taken from discusses the thoughts of the Greek philosopher Posidonius. Seneca agrees with him that in an early stage of mankind, the wise were the rulers. I quote, "Only the best was allowed to be the most powerful." Now this is the moment where I wanted to fling in something more up-to-date, but I decided to leave that. But he disagrees with Posidonius' assumption that philosophy had also invented the skills necessary for daily life, and that only later philosophers withdrew from the various creative arts. Following Diogenes, Seneca states that wise people had taught to be content with less, and not to burden life with all things that are not essential. Actually, a very fashionable thought. I think this is right now. Slim down, the things that you own seems to be the craze right now. He then continues to give examples of fairly recent inventions from a time, that is, when people stopped to believe that philosophers were inventors. Among others, Seneca mentions the making of window glass, which was at that time also a novelty, and glass blowing. Although we assume that glass blowing was invented sometime in the late 1st century BC, it only became an established craft around the time of Seneca. It had a long development through different stages of this technology. And Seneca rightfully considered this technique a novelty. His statement, "shapes that could hardly be accomplished even by the most diligent hands," clearly shows his admiration for the blown glass products of his time. But the truly amazing aspect of this quote lies in the one word that Seneca uses for breath. He could have used suspirium perhaps, or ventus, or like Pliny, an idiom such as flato figurator, but he chose spiritus. Now, air, which in Greek is actually the same word, aer, is a central element of early Greek thinking. According to the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaximenes of Miletus, who lived in the 6th century BC, air is the basic element, or better, principle, from which, through constant movement, the denser and lighter elements originate. The denser would be earth and water, and the lighter one, fire. Air is also the substance that man inhales and breathes out. It thus becomes life per se, and as such a means of communication with the world. Nose and mouth are close to the brain, and the lungs are neighboring the heart, and everything is interconnected, with air as the crucial transmitter. When the glassmaker shapes a glass with his spiritus, and we see some very early glass blowing right here, then more is meant than merely a pneumatic force. To shape his glass, the glassmaker uses the same tools, as it were, as the philosopher does to express his thoughts. Seneca deliberately chose this example to counter the arguments of Posidonius. Beware, not even glass blowing is a philosophical undertaking. A clear line has to be drawn, but among all the crafts, mostly handicrafts, glassmaking stands out for its use of the most noble instrument of man, his breath. Admiration for the glassblowing process apparently never ceased. The so-called Papyrus Oxyrhynchus of the 3rd century AD features a poem that describes glassmaking, and I quote just a little part: "As it tasted the heat of the fire, the crystal was softened by the strokes of Hephaestus, which is fire. He, the glassmaker, blew in from his mouth a quick breath, like a man essaying the art of the flute. But it should be noted that there were also highly critical voices. Clement of Alexandria, who died around 210 to 215 AD, one of the church fathers and therefore an influential voice in medieval culture, seems not to have been particularly captivated by the beauty of the glass of his time. In his Pedagogus, the instructor, he fulminates against costly vessels of gold and silver and those decorated with precious stones, and continues, "The elaborate vanity, too, of vessels in glass chased, more apt to break on account of the art, teaching us to fear while we drink, is to be banished from our well-ordered constitution." As in Pliny's Natural History, we again meet the vessels in glass chased, toreiton hielo. Perhaps Clement had in mind the indented beakers that were popular around his time. This is not a beaker, as you see, but that is a beautiful object in our Glasmuseum in Düsseldorf, and there you see a beaker of which I didn't have a better image. I apologize. These indeed look as if they had been embossed from a sheet of metal, paper thin and light as a feather, neither luxurious nor rare, but nevertheless each and every one a tour de force of glass-blowing skills. Clement may have been acquainted with a proverb by Marcus Valerius Martialis from his Apophoreta in 84 AD, and that should be actually the motto of glass conservators. We have some here in the audience. "You break crystal cups in your anxiety to avoid breaking them. Hands too careless and too anxious are equally destructive." Yet Clement refers to glass, not to raw crystal, that is, to a comparatively ordinary material. Even if chased glass should mean more elaborate vessels than the above-mentioned indented beakers, the context with gold, silver, and precious stones seems remarkable. Here, glass is being counted among the most prominent materials of luxury and vanity. Nobility through condemnation, as it were. Let me now fast forward from ancient Rome to the Middle Ages. I am extremely grateful to Didier Kahn in Paris for having brought to my attention a most remarkable alchemical treatise that was written by the Carmelite monk William Cédasser from Catalonia, Spain, who died in 1382. His Cédacina Totius Artis Alchemiae survived in 15 manuscripts, the oldest dates to 1428-29. Until its edition by Pascal Barthélemy in 2002, it has never been printed. Cédasser's treatise is very remarkable in that it defies all misconceptions about alchemy that have accumulated over time, in particular since the second half of the 18th century. The author himself is rather skeptical about alchemy, as many kings and princes tried their hand and did not achieve perfection. He disapproves of alchemical texts with, I quote, contradictions, obscure language of similes, ellipses, images, metaphors, and superficialities. Instead, he offers 9 very clear rules for the science of alchemy, which I need to show you, although they don't have directly to do with what I'm going to tell you next. Subject yourself to God. Know the things of which this science consists. Know how to proceed. Don't take your hands off the work until you succeeded. And then comes something which I find truly remarkable, so it gets a slide of its own. This science consists of weighing, counting, and measuring. And the last 4, I don't have them on the slide, I just pin them down. Study the philosophical writings until you become worthy of being called a son of these philosophers and of mastering their secrets. Know the right time period, from the beginning to March to the end of September. Keep secrecy, but pass on your knowledge, but only to the worthy. We may today have a different opinion on the right period in the year for chemical practice, but don't these rules sound if they could be maintained as commandments for proper research even today? Cédasser offers 3 definitions of alchemy, of which I give you the first. Alchemy is the art of managing the essence of all metals, bringing their form from the natural diminution artificially to perfection. Essentially, this is a definition of transmutation, of perfecting an ordinary metal in such a way that it turns into a precious one, leading to gold, of course, because this is essentially the only metal that is incorruptible. Cederschiöld points out that what nature makes in 1,000 years, the alchemist has to make in a few days or hours, as can be seen with glass. Ut patet in vitro. While the Cederschiöld is a thoroughly alchemical manuscript, glass plays a major role in it. The chapter on glass is even longer than that on mercury, and there is also a chapter on rock crystal. Cederschiöld's text allows for some remarkable insight into the way that he thinks about glass. He demonstrates glass to be a material that requires significant knowledge to make, but more significantly, he presents glass as a medium of transporting knowledge. What makes glass so fascinating for the alchemist becomes clear from Cederschiöld's definition of glass. He states, yes, this fits. He states, glass is a transparent body artificially reduced into the state of the quintessence. Now, the quintessence, or quinta essentia, is the fifth celestial element in Aristotle's system of elements: earth, water, air, and fire. We heard about them before. Later medieval alchemy defined a common spirit that is at the core of every substance, ranging above the four elements, and saw this quintessence materialized, among others, in alcohol. Cederschiöld defines quintessence in quite a different context. He was clearly aware of the dramatic effects that metal oxides imparted on glass, especially the different colors which can be interpreted as the quintessences of the respective metals. It is, for example, possible to incorporate into glass about 70 weight% of lead. In this process, the black metal loses all of its metalness, as it were, and its impurities, so to say, black color of lead oxide. It is reduced to a more perfect state. It becomes an entirely transparent, brilliant glass. Cederschiöld's claim that man can produce the state of the quintessence through the glass-making process seems absolutely evident. What is the quintessential glass good for? The Cederschiöld presents a number of glass recipes that offer some answers. Most obviously, these recipes can be used to making glass vessels. And I quote, if for the foresaid glass you wish to make vases of various colors, do the following, and so forth. Not surprisingly, these vases would reputedly supersede anything that was available at that time. Alchemy indeed served to improve the quality of glass up into the 18th century. For example, adding lead to the glass batch had a number of beneficial effects on the products. Here we see some fragments from Lübeck. The lead does not necessarily impart a color of its own, maybe just a slight yellowish hue, but it certainly enhances the color from other metal oxides introduced. So in order to gain this kind of bright emerald color, lead is absolutely required. Cederschiöld provides two detailed recipes. Beyond the visual appearance, however, Cederschiöld claimed that the glassy quintessence of these lead glass recipes could be processed into the philosopher's stone. I quote, of which put 1 part to 100 parts of any material that you wish, except iron or Indian steel, and you'll obtain gold better than the natural one. There you go. I shouldn't have told you. The second recipe is not related to the transmutation of metals, but to the reproduction, even to the surpassing of natural precious stones. I quote, and this, which nature made in 1,000 years with the help of the sun, art makes in a few days or hours, influenced by fire. Cederschiöld closes his chapter on glass with a remarkable statement and another definition of glass. This is very long. And praised be the Lord glorious, who has put that convertible stone, he means glass by that, into the view of all people in the churches, mosques, synagogues, houses, public places, taverns, and shops. And he made it ordinary for all people, a sign of recognition and of knowledge of the grand philosopher's stone. As if he said, "See here the sign, the principle, and the right way of our sought-for stone, the work being left to the sages." Glass becomes a sign of recognition and of knowledge of the philosopher's stone. Glass is not the philosopher's stone itself, but a quintessence, a substance that can attain all colors and be transformed into all nature. And it shares a common path, procedure, and process with the philosopher's stone. While earlier alchemists, and possibly even contemporaneous ones, seek the philosopher's stone, glass is an entirely common material, ordinary for all people, as it says, or for all people to see. Glass has its useful aspects, but above all, it carries knowledge. In Plato, Socrates quotes a certain diotima in describing that the seeker of beauty has to be led step by step, from the love of the body to the love of the soul, to the engagement for study and law, and thence to the beauty of knowledge, epistemon kalos. The beauty of knowledge is not glass the perfect expression of this. Therefore, there seems to have been no need in the past to express admiration for glass in writing. Glass itself served as that very expression. Time permitting, and I have no idea because I didn't look what I wanted to on the clock when I started, I should like to present to you a last facet of giving meaning to glass that originates from the Anglo-Saxon period in England. In about 695, Aldhelm, the famous early English poet, abbot of Malmesbury and later bishop of Sherborne, wrote a series of 100 riddles, apparently as an exercise in Latin, metric, and verse. The 80th riddle is entitled Calix Vitreus, glass chalice. And I read you a beautiful translation by Mercedes Salvador Bello. From fissures, that's a word I can't pronounce in English, in rocks, I flowed forth in a slow stream, while flames cracked open the hard inwards of stone, and the heat of the furnace held sway, once the rains had been released. Now my receptive shape gleams forth, very similar to ice. To be sure, many people wish to grasp my neck with their right hands, and to seize my delightfully smooth body with their fingers. But I change their minds as I give kisses to their lips. Applying these sweet kisses to their tightly pressed mouths, and thus I strike down the tottering advances of their feet with disaster. Already the title speaks for the wittiness of the author, as communion chalices were almost never made from glass. The first 4 lines give a description of the formation of glass, very likely from a mixture of ancient sources on the subject. Very unlikely, actually, that the author has ever seen glassmaking. Thus, the beginning may have been adopted from Pliny's legend of the origins of glass that I mentioned to you in passing before. Pliny describes, I quote, rivers of a new translucent liquid that flowed from a fireplace of the Phoenician discoverers of glass. At the very center of the poem, as the gleaming liquid congelates, the scene suddenly changes and a body comes forth that evokes desire. Smoothness and sheen of the material seem innocent enough, and yet the fingers long to caress it. The subsequent stages of seduction can, of course, be read as a call against the abuse of alcohol, but the content of the glass is not mentioned. Rather, it is quite explicitly the glass itself that provokes disaster. Stepping back from the morale of this poem and looking instead only at the description of the glass, it appears that the 2 parts of the poem that seem so disparate at first glance do come together after all. In Aldhelm's eyes, the glass flows gently from tight fissures in rocks, much as the glass vessel delivers its sweet content into compressed mouths. The glass stones are cracked and fall victim to the flame, while the drunkard's legs stumble and fall victim to the glass. The poem thus describes two destructions, and while the first results in a beautiful, albeit dangerous body, we are left to guess that the second won't have as fortunate an outcome. The erotic implications of this text become more explicit in an Anglo-Saxon riddle from the Exeter Book. This largest and most varied collection of Old English poetry has been given to the Exeter Cathedral by its bishop Leofric, who died in 1072, and has probably been written during the third quarter of the 10th century. Only the first half or so of the riddle in question, commonly numbered 63, has survived. There we go. And this is a translation by Patrick Murphy. Often I must serve men well in their hall joy, when I am brought forth, bright with gold, to where men drink. At times a useful servant kisses me on the mouth in my chamber, where we two are. In the embrace of his hands he presses me with his fingers. He works his will. The rest is missing. From the corrupted remnants, however, it can be deduced that the doings of the man must soon be revealed, as his partner cannot conceal them. The riddle does not necessarily refer to glass, but rather to a vessel in general, a chalice or beaker, or possibly a flask or jug. The servant drinks in a separate chamber, most likely for storage purposes, and he will be unable to conceal the loss to the men in the hall, unless they are very drunk already. The vessel is described as being glath mit golde, happy or bright with gold, which might denote a golden ornament, but could perhaps alternatively be understood as the golden shine of beer in a transparent, that is, glass vessel. Glass as an artifact with magic implications, glass as a technological miracle, or as a symbol for the philosopher's stone, as a dangerous accessoire of vanitas, and even as carrier of voluptas. The implications of glass in antiquity and the Middle Ages seem boundless. Yet there is a common denominator in the beauty of glass and the fascination for it. The ancient and medieval richness, subtlety, and even contrariness of meanings bestowed on something as utilitarian and ordinary as a drinking glass has since been lost. It may be time to recover some of these fragile traces. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for taking us on a tour through the, not quite history of sentiment, but the intersection of the material and the emotional. Floor is now open for questions.
Thank you so much for such a learned disquisition on glass. It was really wonderful. I'm very struck with the 14th century alchemical treatise that talks about glass. I knew nothing about it, so thank you very much. And this idea that glass carries the essence of metals is then developed by maybe other people, but I know it from Johann Rudolf Glauber, who says that souls of humans are tinged in this, or rather humans are, their soul is like the tinging of glass through the essence of metals, which is so, full of meaning and significance. But then I was talking to my colleague, the Byzantine historian, and he said that this is the same idea that's expressed in 11th and 12th century, I think, maybe even earlier, Byzantine treatises also. So I'm very curious whether you know where that comes from. The idea of the soul of, the essence of metals tinging glass, which is giving them colors, obviously. But it seems to be very much, a material which can connote, and a process which connotes spiritual, insight, or gives spiritual insight.
Right. Well, I think the process is pretty evident. You can start with something like cobalt, fling that into a glass batch, I believe, I mean, I've never tried it myself, that it's actually very easy to color glass blue with cobalt as long as you don't take too much of it. And you will end up with the essence of this color in a much more shiny way than this dark original material. Of course, I don't know the original source for such a statement. To me, it seems almost that something like what Seneca said with the spiritus might have helped, that the breathing and the color imparted by the metal have been somehow put together a little bit. Because I think there are other sources that also state that the soul of the glassmaker enters the glass with his breath. So that he's almost because and actually Becher, of course, claimed, which was wrong, but still that he invented white glass, that kind of porcelain type glass, by adding bone ash to the glass, and he stated that he wanted his own bones after his death being made into white glass. So whenever you drink from a white milky glass, perhaps you are having Johann Joachim Becher in front of you. While Becher actually means beaker, cup, so.
So let me just add, it doesn't work to add bone ash to.
Oh yes, it does.
It does.
But it was known previously, and the Venetians had done some white glass before.
Kai.
Thank you very much. Just follow up on Pamela's comments. So all of this thing with the spiritus I found fascinating. And there's a very interesting parallel, of course, to the story of creation, right? When God is breathing spiritus into the then earth-made mold known as Adam, right? And I was wondering if you find in your glass-related texts anything that alludes to the artist as a god blowing spiritus or air into the material, thus in a way animating it or forming it. So that would be a first question.
I don't, but that is simply due to my lack of knowledge of all those sources. You know, I took this from just a side remark in a long letter by Seneca, so there's always the danger of over-interpreting these things, but then Seneca, of course, is so crisp in the way he uses language that one can really put every single word onto the gold balance, so to say. But of course it is very intriguing to think that glassmakers, when and if they saw this tradition of spiritus and the ancient tradition as a word for breath and for soul, and at the same time reading the Bible, that must have come together quite clearly. And to me it is evident that glassmakers thought of themselves as doing a very special craft. Actually, up to the 18th century, this was the only craft that aristocrats were allowed to do. And I think there's some connotation there that it was simply a noble way of producing them.
But so it leads me to the second question is about, I mean, my early medieval texts always find the glassmaker as somebody who's also a bronze caster. I mean, the artisanal locale is basically the same place. And it could be that this confusion or relations that Pamela found between metals and glass is just a result of that being practiced in the same artisanal locale. Never as early as 9th century text of bell casters that are also very good in making glass.
Mm-hmm.
And when Isidore of Seville actually talks about bronze, he talks about it as being made out of air. That's why it's called ice aeris, because it gleams in the air. So there's a lot of proximity, I think, both in early techniques, but at the same time, understanding. And I think the understanding always comes from the place of the artisanal locale as to the relations or the proximity between glass making and metalwork. And of course, they all in the end relate to alchemy, or alchemy is generated from that exact place when these two practices are.
I guess the latter is true because alchemy only started around the time that Cedasser put down his writing. That's actually a very early alchemical text, I believe.
Well, started in the Latin West.
Yeah.
Yeah, not the Arab world.
But the Western tradition is
Yeah, okay.
rather late. But okay, 100 years earlier perhaps.
Yeah.
I find that really fascinating what you say, that one has to look at these other materials. And of course, when you look at early glass making, the workshops were often, as far as the archaeological records tell, combined with ceramics as well, and with bronze casting, of course. And bronze casting has its completely own tradition of great implications of giving life to something, because there are all these veins, basically, through which the liquid metal flows and then gives a lifelike object, basically. So this was certainly a project that was a process that was considered as being basically like birth giving. So yeah, that is definitely something I should follow up on. I hope I find some more specific connotations. Of course, the sources are very rare. I mean, it's, these are essentially by chance finds of little snippets, as I said. It's not that we have a big apparatus of works that we can draw from, especially for the early period.
I'm really curious about some of the references you make to soul and spirit, and also when you just say about the glass being the craft that was acceptable as a kind of aristocratic employment or craft that the aristocracy could pursue, and also that Itai mentions the idea of the biblical story of Adam, the way that glass has its own unique materiality and material process, but also kind of touches on the immaterial, right? Even early modern or ancient glass does this, I think, even though it's not as, I work on stuff in the 20th century, and we're talking much more about the transparent qualities of glass at that point. But it's curious to me to think about glass as kind of almost an embodiment of the soul or the spirit, in contrast to something like the idea of God breathing life into dirt or clay, right? That's very much dirt and getting your hands dirty. And I'm wondering if that's something that you come across in some of these sources, the kind of liminality of material and immateriality.
I must admit I haven't.
Yeah.
And it sounds so evident that it's one of those typical sources that one is searching for, and eventually I hope to find something in this respect, because the transparency of glass certainly must have played some role. However, transparency is something that glass takes from rock crystal, essentially, and rock crystal has always been the model for glass making. So I'm not sure if this was something that would have related just very specifically to glass. The perfection of transparency has not been reached basically until the early 18th century, I guess, when rock crystal was really copied in a way that you have to look very closely to distinguish a glass from a rock crystal object. Up to then, this was the constant drive to get there. Basically, actually from old Egyptian times on. I think there's some transparent glass in old Egyptian tombs as well.
Early Islamic too.
Oh yeah. Well, even
Crystal
you've
clear.
seen this Achaemenid bowl from Persia. That is actually a prime example of very early transparent glass, which certainly did impress not only the Persians but also the Greeks. As I said, that had some impact. And transparent glass was actually used by Phidias to make the Zeus statue in Olympia.
If I may, just a perverse question.
Oh, I love it.
The talk, the questions, all focus on the magical, the divine, the human range of metaphors for the process of making glass and the glass as an extant item. What about the critics of glass? Is there a counter to this elaborate language of praise in a language of criticism? Or, to put it another way, is there a moment when the positive, extraordinary, magical valuation of glass crashes down?
Mm-hmm. This is not perverted at all. I think that's quite natural that glass, especially its breaking property, has been addressed as well. As I mentioned, what was the Clement of Alexandria is actually such a critical version. There is another one which, due to time, I didn't go into much, and that is the proverb of the friend of glass, amicus vitrius. And that shows up in early medieval sources. Well, there's the wonderful tales of the monastery in Constance, which was extremely rich around the, 1000 AD. And there was an abbot called Salomo who was apparently very witty to even enhance the richness of this monastery. He got lands from some landgraves, which the king gave to him rather than to these graves. They were not amused about it, and he invited them for a dinner in order to reconsole a little bit. And he showed them, among others, glass vessels. These are mentioned twice in the text deliberately, that they particularly admired the glass vessels. I believe that these were actually Islamic glass vessels, not European ones. Be that as it may, he then goes on to brag about his monastery, and they thoroughly disliked that. And when, as was common at the time, they were given presents, among others these two glass vessels, they would just pick up the glass vessels and let them fall and say, glass, you don't give glass to a friend in order to insult him as a glassy friend. And then I looked up, and that is the sake of Google. You look up, well, what is an amicus vitrius? And there comes the definition 200 years later in an Italian book, which says that an amicus vitrius is a friend that takes everything so seriously that he breaks immediately at the slightest offense. There you go. So, in fact, at that time, it was actually a very unpolite thing to give a glass. You should remember that when you have something that you take with you to the next party. Yeah. So, and incredibly surprising what kind of ways meaning of glass can actually take. And of course, I'm dealing just with this one material. If you expand on that and go into other materials, I think the richness is just overwhelming.
One more question, Suzanne?
Yeah, slightly a related question. Again, wondering about possible negative connotations. Looking at antiquity, because you showed clearly that in some ways glass was first of all imitation lapis lazuli, and then in the Greek period, again, the terms of glass and rock crystal are similar. So again, there was this striving to have glass be imitation rock crystal. So do we have sources that show that people were aware that glass was not the same quality, it was not the real thing? So
that is a very interesting question, because what lies behind this is whether the concept of imitation was then the same that we have today. If we think of imitation, we always think of something pejorative. It's cheap, basically. The real thing is what counts. I tend to believe that in the past it was quite the opposite. The imitation was actually, to some degree and in certain periods, much more precious than the original, because it showed that man can reach that level. And as a matter of fact, a lapis lazuli imitation in glass is actually superior to original lapis lazuli, because the original lapis lazuli has all kinds of impurities, the calcite and the pyrite, which, however, has different connotations yet. There is a description of a lapis lazuli tablet where the little pyrite dots demark the astronomic constellation of the stars. That's something that glass cannot provide. But other than that, the glass lapis lazuli must first, in an age where color was considered as a prime characteristic of a material, really have blown off the minds of the people. And we have reason to believe that at certain periods glass might have been even more expensive than the original lapis lazuli. However, that only takes then a certain time. At some time, of course, it becomes cheap because you can produce big amounts of glass. And so that is the history of glass. It's always in waves. A new technological achievement has been found. It becomes boring at the time, 2 generations later perhaps. And so either something else comes up or glass kind of vanishes slightly. And that is what happened, granted, only 500 years later in Egypt at this first generation of glass making. Then comes a big void where we don't really know what was going on. And then basically the old tradition was picked up, same vessels reproduced, but on a much lower quality scale. So you see that glass then becomes a commodity that is kind of not quite so precious and admired anymore. And then at some point comes glass blowing, and we have a similar affair. When we hear about glass blowing, the invention of glass blowing, I think it's quite naturally to think that a technique where you can blow a big vessel basically in 3 minutes, be done with it, must have been revolutionary. And of course it was. But it took a long time to become revolutionary. For the first century, people didn't see that advantage outright. They saw that the old techniques of forming glass were also rather quick, and they served their purpose, and besides, you didn't need a big vessel made of glass because you had your amphorae and whatnot. So it took time until this was established. However, the Torreuton Vitro, or Torreuton Hielo, the mold-blown glass, which is essentially the same, only that I don't make a free-blown glass, but I blow it into a mold, that captured the imagination of the authors, because here we have yet another imitation. We are able to make silver out of glass. And so I believe that at this early stage, the mold blowing of glass was considered, that was what was appreciated, not the fact of blowing in general. And that switched then later when people saw that blowing itself is just a big industrial means. So I just feel that it's very fascinating to look into these sources and be very careful about modern implications, which we always naturally put into these texts. When we read them, we always have to translate them. And what I found is that you can't trust any translation of these Latin texts. You always have to look at the original sources. And you will always find that in the tradition of putting a more elegant language to the translations, the essence in terms of these little details is completely lost. So, yeah, fascinating subject.
One more question, Pamela?
I don't know, this may be too specific a question, but do we have any indications of how glass blowing came into being? You know, was it sort of a transfer of technique from some other process?
Well,
it's not exactly intuitive, obviously.
No, actually, it's a weird, as far as I know, it's a very weird tradition of technology, because it apparently started off, and we have archaeological evidence of that in Israel, of making tubes. So glass was somehow flattened out and then rolled up on a stick, and you have a glass tube, you cool off one side, you heat up the other one, and you blow into the glass tube and then get your blown glass. Incredibly complicated. And it took, I don't know, 50, 100 years until actually the metal blowing rod was then invented. So, and you see actually quite a period where there's a combination of the old techniques. For instance, I showed you those 3 vessels, it takes too long, where you have bands of different colors. These were molten together somehow, and then only later the tube was applied just to get this slight bubble shape. So glass blowing at the beginning was actually very complicated and not easy at all. As soon as the technique had been developed properly and the mold blowing became something possible to make. And mold blowing is not that trivial either. You need a very specific glass composition to be able to make a crisp piece. There have been wonderful exhibitions recently in Corning, I think in New York as well, about the onion glass and so forth. That is the moment where, it really takes off.
I think this is an appropriate moment then to thank Dedo, our speaker tonight. For the range, the breadth, and the elegance that Paul and Irene Hollister would have so admired. You're all invited to a reception outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This was wonderful. Thank you.